So I want to pick up where I left off. So I left off with the brain, talking about the way the brain shapes our ethics and morality, and all of those built-in brain functions that shape us in ways that we're not aware of, and yet have a huge impact on the way we come to see decision-making and the outcomes that go with that. What we're going to do for the next little bit is an introduction then to the model I'm going to carry through for the rest of the course that begins to look at one way of looking at how the brain functions to guide us, and then how we can work with that to more effectively do ethical analysis. So the ideal is to come out of this with a sense of the ways that we can work with our brain to more effectively assess what's going on, respond to it, understand what others are doing, and develop our own perspectives that make better sense to us. There's a little bit of a backwardsness to what we're going to do, but I think it'll make sense as we proceed over the next few weeks. But this is just an introduction to the ideas, and then we can talk about your assessment results, which fit, I think, with this fairly closely, and then see where it goes from there. So the theory that I've developed, and I've really cautioned that this is my theory, I think it's well supported in some respects. I think it's conjecture on my part with other respects. It makes sense to me in terms of the available empirical evidence. But as far as I can tell, I'm the only person to have drawn these conclusions, this particular way of concluding from the empirical evidence, though there are others who are very close to my perspective. So it's not like I am wildly unique, but this is a unique way. And it emerges because I read the research literature in a particular way, which is I read it from an ethics perspective. The other folks who've been working with this have been looking at this more in terms of how people make decisions. And they come to some different conclusions. Not tremendously different in some respects, but significantly different in others. Because what I did is I brought to it an ethics perspective. I tried to figure out, well, what are the varieties of ethical approaches and how can they be encompassed in one neuroscientific theory? Whereas other folk have been much more intuitive or inductive, coming from watching how people make decisions and then trying to structure it from there. My response to that is, I think those of us working in moral philosophy and philosophical ethics have spent a lot of years, we're actually talking millennia now, trying to figure out the different strategies human beings can take to things. Those must reflect the way our brains actually function. So if we look at those ethics, we are in fact doing a lot of primary research into how the brain works. That's the theory. My conclusion is we have 7 moral, emotional structures in our brain. That is, they're built in. We'll look at them. We'll see how they work and what they do over the coming weeks. They are unconscious forms of analysis. They are actual, it's like computer subroutines. And you pick the one that you think fits best to the situation and you apply it, and you have 7. Or 8. Maybe 9. We don't know. We really don't know. My gut sense is that there are at least 8 and maybe 9, but I can only identify 7 with clarity. But one of those 7 looks like it's got 2 or 3 mixed in there. There's a PhD project trying to figure out how many forms of moral, emotional thinking there are. But I think part of it is because of the brain and the way it functions. If I understand the underlying organic processes properly, it gets mushy. It isn't making clear distinctions. And so when it gets hard to draw clear distinctions, it's because the brain itself is not working clearly. That it works very clearly at some levels, but as you move up in terms of the complexity, it gets harder and harder for the brain itself to do the work, and it gets kind of more and more mushy and confused. Anyway, we'll look at that as we get on. So what you have is you've got these 7, and you choose which ones you're going to apply, again, unconsciously, on the basis of the perceived fit. Does it fit the framework you're working in? And we'll look at the assessment tool because that's trying to get at that issue of perceived fit. You are trying in that assessment to perceive a fit between one of 5 of these 7 and a particular type of situation. You apply them also contextually. You do not apply them universally. You apply them depending on the context in which you're working, living. That is, you have a certain sense of this fits the problem. This also fits the social location. And so you have to put the two together. We're not going, well, yes, we are going to look at this a little bit. You use visual metaphors for abstract reasoning. And the point there is that you have more brain capacity around your visual centers than you do for anything else. That is, our brains are very good at visualizing. Most of the time you don't do much with that. That is, your brain was built for a creature that used to live in 3-dimensional environments, used to swing through trees, and then came down into a 2-dimensional environment and has all this brain capacity left over for trying to assess the world around it. And that becomes then the basis of our abstract reasoning. So you use 3-dimensional, we're going to look at 2-dimensional, but they could be 3-dimensional. I'm not going to worry about it particularly. Visual metaphors for reasoning. They're rooted in the prefrontal cortex. That's the decision-making part of the brain. Well, that makes sense because we're trying to make decisions. Again, as I point out very carefully, they vary in attestation in the academic literature. That is, there are folks who have some pretty clear answers to why particular parts of what I'm going to use are there in the form that I'm talking about. So there's some really good research on some of them, but others not so much. So again, as I said, this follows from all ethical systems, and they are the frameworks also for applying moral understandings, and we'll get to that. The result is that what we've got are 7 ways of processing our world in moral, emotional, relational terms. Each of us is going to do it differently. That is, we're going to make an assessment of which one we're going to use. We'll see that from the assessment results. We use them differently, but we also have different content for them based on what we've learned. That is, the structure is universal. The application, the content, that's up to you, your culture, your background, and all the rest. So it's unique and distinct to you at one level, and yet we share it at another. So part of what allows us to do good things with this is because they're shared, we can assess those structures, and then we can actually learn how do we want to use them more effectively. We have uses that we've learned. Where are we going to go in the future? And that's the wonder of human beings and our human capacities, is we're not confined to what we have. We can start working with it. We can transform it. We can't change the fact that we have 7, or maybe 8, but what we can do is change the way we work with them, and there's no question about that. So what we're going to do is, in the next little bit, look, so here we go. These are the 7 basic ones. And the idea is it's like we have a selector switch in our head. It's actually more like a set of steps. And it chooses these, and then we work with them.
Excuse me.
Yes?
We choose them consciously?
No.
Unconsciously?
Unconsciously. It's fascinating to watch. No, we choose them unconsciously, and if once you know what you're listening for, you can actually hear people flipping through them in their conversation, because they will start choosing different words and structures to fit the different frameworks. There's a language scholar named Steven Pinker who actually says that this is critical to the way we use language as well. So he doesn't accept my 7. He might actually if he knew about them, but he doesn't. But we're both working with the same underlying work, work of a California anthropologist named Alan Page Fisk. Both Pinker and I have read his work and think that it is a critical insight into the way the brain processes reality. Pinker says it's structural. It is the way we use language as well. And he says you can name it, you can see it, and I think he's right. When I'm listening to people, particularly since it's my field, when they're trying to make a decision and people are talking themselves through a decision, you can hear them moving through these, or a few of these. Usually it's only 2 or 3 of them. as they're trying to make a decision.
And our genes, does it any effect or connection with them for the whole people as the same, or someone has it, each of them more stronger?
That's a good question. Do our genes change that? And I would say my sense is yes. But the question would be how, because when we start looking at them, they are a logical set of models. It's as if the brain takes careful, logical steps built around mathematical principles, and you don't really have a lot of choice. You either you got them or you don't. And if you don't have them, you're likely to drop off at one end of the range or the other, that is, the bottom or the top, because it's simply stepped in between. So that's where I would go. If I was looking for genetic testing, I would look for people who don't have the extremes, and we'll look at that over the next while. I suspect there is a certain genetic drop-off, that a certain percentage of people really don't experience those extremes. But most people do, have to, because that's how we function together. But that might be a key to why there are certain kinds of mental illness, is people don't make those kinds of decisions. They don't have those kinds of ways of doing things. But depending on your culture, you will have these as very well developed or poorly developed in your brain. That is, if you use them, your brain gets stronger and faster at using them. Okay? If you don't use them, your brain gets weaker. They may exist, but they may only have that much capacity. But another one that you're using a lot, you'll have that much capacity.
So is it correct to say that it's a sort of a way of thinking? Because if it's a way of thinking, then we can train it.
Yes, exactly. It is a mode of thinking. That is, you've got 7 modes, but your ability to use them is completely a matter of training. That's why I talk about them, because I want to train you in how to use them more effectively. I also want to train you in how to assess how other people are using them, because people are using them. So what are they doing? How are they doing it? What do you like to see? Why? And how do they like to see, and why? And what does that do? And I've really noted, I've assessed a good number of people so far, not nearly as many as I'd like to make any definitive conclusions, but there are clear patterns that show up in different types of roles. That, in fact, some of them are quite surprising to me, but make perfect sense in the way people have learned to use their brains and these options depending on their jobs. So one of the things I say about that assessment tool is it varies depending on your job. If you move from one job to another, over time your thinking patterns will change to fit your work. That is, there are certain kinds of thinking that work for a particular job and other kinds that do not. You will lose the ones that do not, and you will pick up and expand and develop the ones that do. You can't help it. You know, we're learning organisms. We're learning all the time. We're trying to develop. We can't, you know, we just respond to the world. We change. So you're going to change. But I think, my theory is, that once you know these, you can actually develop exercises to improve them. You can focus, you can think about it, and become stronger in those areas that are important to you.
How?
How? That's a good question. What I'm planning to do, if I ever get some time and some money, is to develop a set of exercises that should help people develop it. And the way what they're going to be based around is scenarios, is that I think if you sit down with a scenario that is organized to think it through in one of these ways, and you simply go through it and think it through and imagine yourself in a day going through that scenario, it actually will help strengthen your mind, literally build the brain circuits necessary so that you find it easier to do that. That's the theory. And then I should be able to retest and see if you've developed that. Anyway. I haven't got the time, I don't have the money, I don't have the access to be able to do all that. I just, too much of this, just too much happening. Anyway. Somebody knows somebody who would like to invest in a really interesting kind of social HR tool. I'd really like to, spend time working with a major corporation, something with, 10 or 15,000 people and spend a few years working at this. Anyway, I think it could have some really interesting productivity outcomes, very, very positive. I think you could do cultural change with this stuff. Anyway, so 5 forms of them. This is, okay, so this is what the assessment itself is looking at, are these 5. So, and then there's 2 more which we'll look at. 3 of them are very well attested. So these 3, they're in the developmental psychology literature, they're in the language studies literature, they're in anthropological literature. These are very well attested. That is, we have a sense of way of organizing the world that I call, and this is my language, familial, that has to do with our sense of identity, community, family, our sense of sociality, how we relate to people in a caring way. So care, compassion, generosity all flow out of this mindset, because it's a mindset, I call it familial because we learn it in our family, that's our primary focus of it. We can use it anywhere, for anything. We'll talk about that next week. Then there's the hierarchical, which is our sense of order, how things are structured in terms of roles, rules, responsibilities, who has rank. So it's very much our sense of rank, who ranks higher than whom. And human beings do this one automatically. It's well attested. We walk into a room and we just unconsciously start assessing everybody for rank. It's bizarre. And if we were all to assess each other for rank, we've been around together long enough, and we had a list and we just put everybody's name and in a rank order, we would probably have the same 6 people listed in the top 6, and then it would get fuzzy and we would have differences. But that's our unconscious assessment of each other, our personal presence and power in relationship to others in the group. And then if we start taking that apart, you would find that that rank ordering depends on issues of personality, education, age, gender, and all those factors that kind of structure our way of thinking. But we would have them amazingly similar. But it's all unconscious. Well supported. Equitability as well, very strongly attested. Our sense of fairness, turn-taking, good playground behavior, but it goes well beyond that. And we'll take a look at that, not next week. These 2 we'll look at next week, and then the week after we'll start with this one. These 2 are very basic in many respects. They're learned in families. Here we're moving into the larger social world and how we relate to others. And literally, we learned it in the playground. Kids on the street. And very powerful form of moral analysis. Everybody knows when something's fair or not. Or do we? Well, we have the same kind of assessment that we're bringing. We don't turn out to assess things identically. Well, that's the culture and individual aspects. Okay, so those 3 are well supported. Next week, week after, and then these 2, I would say, are reasonably supported. That is, there's literature that supports them. It's harder to assess. I would say that this is, in fact, my breakdown. Different people will work with these in different ways. As one perspective, actually, Ellen Page Fisk combines these 2 into one. In fact, how I got to these 2 is I took his one and said, I think they're 2 different things he's combined. What happens if I pull them apart? And so I tried, and they came apart. They broke into 2 conceptually distinct categories that make very good psychological sense. But they're often found together. That's one of the reasons why I think he would end up as an anthropologist sticking them together. But if you start looking at them in terms of ethics, well, now we've got 2 really different ways of doing ethics that are involved here. Quite fascinating from my point of view. Very helpful, actually. So there's the tactical, which has our sense of growth diminishing. Are things getting bigger or smaller? Very easy for us to assess that. Also tied to that, a sense of direction and movement. This is why I talk about, are these in 3 dimensions or 2? We can talk about them as 2-dimensional, but I think they really are more 3-dimensional in the brain, the way that we work with them. But that